This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, here's a disturbing trend in politics in Western Europe, specifically the UK. Leftist activists have started to throw milkshakes on political figures on the right. Perhaps even more disturbing is that political commentators have in some instances seemed amused by these attacks and reported them without criticism, other than that those attacked and others on the right objected to them. Some commentators actually laughed while commenting on the attacks. That's right. Commentators and purported journalists actually found it humorous that an action which actually could result and has resulted in the attacker being charged with battery was committed on a politician for no other reason than disagreement with his political views. That type of action, a battery, is the bridge too far in a nation's politics. When you accept throwing milkshakes on those you oppose politically, the next step is fists, followed by more deadly weapons. Journalism, which is supposed to be one of the keys to ensuring a free society, has become so corrupted that some of its practitioners find it amusing when activities which can foretell the loss of a free society are directed at the side of the political fence opposite where those journalists stand. That's a shame and a disgrace. If this obnoxious trend reaches the U.S., I hope the authorities throw the book at those who throw the milkshakes. I would be completely in support of making an example of the first person prosecuted so that when the public sees serious prison time being meted out, this latest fad would end instantly. Do I think it would happen? My initial prediction was that the first attack would probably happen in Chicago, and District Attorney Kim Foxx would probably dismiss the charges and try to get the record sealed. Call me a cynic. Well, last week this trend did reach the United States. Somebody threw a drink which ended up not being a milkshake, but rather a red drink like punch or cranberry juice at Congressman Matt Gaetz in Pensacola, Florida. Incredibly, the unhinged leftist who apparently did the throwing, Amanda L. Kondratyev, ran against Gaetz in 2016 and lost. What better evidence of a breakdown of the political process on the left? If you can't beat them, commit battery by throwing a milkshake at them. Well, battery is exactly what she's been charged with. I'm a bit more hopeful that in Pensacola, Florida, they won't pull what Kim Foxx did in Chicago and drop the charges. We'll have to wait and see. Well, it's time to move on to the next topic, but before we do so, I want to issue a minor correction to the podcast from last week. I had said that all Democratic congresspersons had voted for the Equality Act, which would have codified nationwide a requirement that transgender females who are biological males be allowed to compete against biological females in women's sports. Actually, rather than every one of them voting for it, all except 6 Democratic congresspersons voted for it. Those 6 did not, however, oppose it. Instead, they simply didn't vote. However, all 6 actually co-sponsored the legislation, even though they chose not to vote when the time came. In fact, every Democrat congressperson except Dan Lipinski from Illinois had co-sponsored the bill, and in the end, Congressman Lipinski actually voted for it. So once again, it's crystal clear that there is overwhelming support in the Democratic Party for the insanity of allowing transgender females who are biological males to compete against biological women in women's sports. Next topic. The IRS scandal. You remember when we used to talk about IRS targeting of Tea Party groups and other groups on the right? Frankly, until this most recent scandal from the Obama administration regarding what appears to be FBI and intelligence agencies spying on the Trump campaign, in part through obtaining FISA warrants based on unverified Oppo research paid for by the Democratic Party and the Hillary campaign, and obtained from Russian sources, apparently without disclosing to the FISA court that the source was unverified and funded by the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton. Until that scandal, the biggest scandal in the Obama administration, in my view, was the IRS targeting of Tea Party groups and other conservative groups. The hugely disproportionate focus only on groups on the right made it obvious what was going on. And for those who had their doubts, Lois Lerner pleading the Fifth Amendment should have resolved them. But there are still plenty of people on the left who dispute to this day that anything inappropriate was done by the IRS. Well, that issue has now been resolved because the lawsuit filed by True the Vote against the IRS over its targeting of the group has come to an end. And the result was that the IRS was made to pay maximum attorney's fees. U.S. District Judge Reggie Walton ruled that True the Vote was entitled to a, quote, bad faith enhancement, close quote, of attorney's fees to be paid by the IRS. As Breitbart notes in coverage in an article by Matthew Boyle on June 6, the judge stated that there has been a showing by, quote, clear and convincing evidence necessary for a finding of bad faith, close quote, by the IRS. The fees awarded could be as much as approximately $2 million. Frankly, as a taxpayer, it's frustrating to me that we have to fund this payment. I'd like to see it come out of the pockets of the Obama-era IRS officials, including Lois Lerner, who engaged in the targeting. The reality is that this finding alone should cause any cable news or network TV show commentators or journalists who claim that the Obama administration has suffered through no scandals to take it back. Using the IRS to punish political adversaries is not only terrifying, but it also shows a disturbing lack of commitment to the future good of the country. Our government couldn't get anything done without tax revenue. And using the IRS as a political weapon can't help but lead to a situation where people stop viewing it as a legitimate government organization. The incentive to cheat on taxes is purely monetary. But if the tax collection agency is used as a political weapon, then you run the risk that half the taxpayers will have an additional reason to try to short the government on their tax payments, because they see the tax agency as a political arm of the other side from their politics. And with each billion of revenue that isn't collected, more things that we want our government to do will not be able to be done. For any administration to risk that for political gain is an enormous scandal. But the targeting of conservatives by the IRS basically killed a political movement. It killed the Tea Party movement. And if that movement had not been killed, Barack Obama might not have won re-election. And unfortunately, for many in the Obama administration, I suspect that shamefully they view that as justification enough for what was done. Next topic. Burying the climate change debate. Something really interesting happened recently with the upcoming debates for the Democrat Party presidential nomination. Before we talk through that specific development, let me give you some background for it. As you know from listening to prior episodes, the Green New Deal was filed in the House by Democrat Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and in the Senate by Democrat Senator Ed Markey. We've talked previously about the overwhelming cost of that plan if it were ever implemented in episode 22 of Political Spirits, entitled Cortez, Crenshaw, and Cow Farts. The cost is by some estimates more than $49 trillion. So what happened with those bills? Well, the Republicans brought it up for a vote in the Senate, and despite the fact that the proposal had received widespread expressions of support and numerous co-sponsors from the Democrats, when the vote was held, 43 Democrats voted present rather than voting for or against the bill. 3 Democrats and 1 independent joined all 53 Senate Republicans in voting against the bill. In this podcast, I had labeled the bill as absurd and Democrat expressions of support for it as evidence that they weren't ready for leadership. Since then, I've received pushback from some on the left who contend that the Green New Deal is a great proposal and a positive for the Democrats. I consistently push back not only by attacking the specifics of the proposal, as I did in episode 22, but also by pointing to the Democrats' decision to vote present in the Senate rather than actually supporting the bill when it came up for a vote. How can a bill be a positive for and represent the future path of a party if its members won't even take the simple step of voting in favor of it when it comes up for a vote? The fact that they were unwilling to vote for it supports my contention that it's so unrealistic and so outrageously expensive that pushing for it shows Democrats should not be taken seriously as potential leaders of the country going forward. Now, surely that assertion will anger many on the left, but the most recent development regarding the climate change issue makes me wonder whether the Democrat Party leadership may agree with me. That development is that Washington State Governor Jay Inslee requested that climate change be the subject for one of the upcoming Democrat Party presidential debates. The Democratic National Committee, the DNC, responded swiftly to Inslee's request. They rejected it. They also advised him that if he participated in anybody else's climate debate, he would not be invited to any of the future Democratic presidential debates. So why'd the DNC do that? Well, they might have done it for the reason they've given since then, which is that they want to make sure the debates are broad-based rather than single-subject focused. They might have done it because they think that their best bet is Joe Biden, and they think the other candidates might perform better on that subject. I think they did it for a combination of 2 reasons. The first is that if Joe Biden is going to get the Democrat presidential nomination, his only shot in the general election will be if he's managed to maintain his image as a centrist. But if he has to work too hard to do that in the Democratic primaries, he runs the risk that he'll alienate enough leftist Democrats that he may not be able to count on them in the general election. The second reason is that the Green New Deal is in fact outrageously unrealistic. And if the Democratic National Committee were to allow a debate to be focused exclusively on climate change, there would be endless discussion of the Green New Deal and a competition among all of those candidates to see just how far to the left they can go and just how many wild ideas they can come up with to show their commitment to the left's climate change agenda. What would be the effect of that display? I think there's a strong likelihood that it could show the current iteration of the Democratic Party to be a party not to be taken seriously. Like a party of stoned college professors and equally stoned graduate students competing with each other to come up with the most unrealistic, pie-in-the-sky proposals that are about as close to being doable in the real world as Hillary Clinton is to likability or President Trump is to modesty. And I think the Democratic Party leadership knows that. And one of the reasons why they may know that is they may have been following what's happened in Australia. All of the polling in Australia had indicated for weeks that the Prime Minister's Liberal National Coalition, the Australian version of Republicans or Conservatives, was going to lose to the Labour Party, the Australian version of Democrats in America. But when it came time for the election, the polls were proven wrong. The Australian equivalent of the Republican Party won. Why? The consensus seems to be that the voters trusted the Australian equivalent of the Republicans on the economy and pushed back against the climate change efforts of the Australian equivalent of the Democrats. But that didn't happen equally across the country. The resource-rich Australian states, which are mostly rural, voted for the equivalent of the Republicans. The cities voted more for the equivalent of the Democrats. In that respect, the election looked very much like the 2016 presidential election in America. Except in the Australian election, opposition to left-wing climate change efforts was much more of a factor than it was in America in 2016. So, how could that Australian election experience be replicated in the U.S.? Well, one way to do it would be to have climate change take center stage in the Democrat debates by having one of the debates deal with nothing but climate change, and likely involve repeated references to the Green New Deal that Democrats in Congress were willing to talk positively about, but in the end they were so nervous about it that they only voted present. Can I prove that the Democrat leadership was looking to Australia when they made this decision? Absolutely not. Am I confident that they thought about it, and it was at least one of their prime concerns, and perhaps the primary concern? Absolutely. The only question is whether the multitude of candidates that want to have that debate will be able to pressure the DNC to budge on the issue. We'll see. If they do and they allow such a climate change-specific debate, it won't be good for the Democrat Party, and it will be good for Donald Trump. As I've said before, the best thing that can happen in the 2020 election is that the Democrats lose so catastrophically that it forces the party back to the center. Therefore, I guess you could say that I hope that they do have a climate change-specific debate. We'll see what happens. Next topic. Trump and Mexico. When President Trump last week threatened to impose 5% tariffs on all goods coming to the U.S. from Mexico if Mexico didn't take significant and serious actions to stem the tide of illegal immigration flooding to the U.S. border, and then quickly ramp those tariffs up in steps all the way to 25%, the media, Democrats, and many in the Republican Party went nuts. I understand that the Democrats don't want to control the border. In the end, they're probably well aware that they're importing future Democrats. I don't respect that attitude. In fact, it disgusts me. But I understand it. Most of the media survives based on the anti-Trump narrative. I've said before that it's a shame that CNN ignored the opportunity to move to the center, practice actual journalism, and occupy a position which would allow it to grow beyond the size to which it's limited when it has to split the anti-Trump viewership with MSNBC. Most of the cable news and network news basically came down with a case of the vapors regarding Trump's tariff threat against Mexico. But what frustrated me the most was the Republicans who wavered and pushed back against the president. They can see the border is out of control. They can see that the numbers coming into the country are far beyond our ability to process them in ICE facilities and the justice system. The tide has to be stemmed. And they could see that President Trump was engaging in a negotiation. And when some Republicans came out publicly against those tariffs, they undermined the president in those negotiations. In the end, on Saturday, June 8, President Trump announced that Mexico and the U.S. had reached an agreement regarding the steps Mexico would take to stem the tide of illegal immigration, and the tariffs would not take effect. If anybody looks at this objectively and thinks about the nature of a negotiation, they have to conclude that when it comes to these sorts of issues, when it comes to these instances where America is negotiating with other countries regarding treaties or any form of agreement, the fact that we have Donald Trump as president is a positive. When those Republicans following on from the Democrats and the media came out in opposition to the tariffs, with any other president, the negotiations would have been placed in jeopardy. With this president, they weren't. Why? Now, you could argue that any accomplished business person could succeed in such negotiations, and you would be right to a point. You would be right to the extent that many politicians are not good negotiators, and business leaders may be more likely to be good negotiators. But what this president faces is not the norm. The opposition party and the media, and to some extent his own party, go far beyond what I've seen with past presidents in their efforts to come out against him. There doesn't even seem to be a recognition in many instances that stemming the tide of illegal immigration at the border is something that would be good for the country. In the face of that opposition, President Trump still succeeded this week in getting that deal with Mexico. He succeeded because he has never stopped fighting with the opposition, whether that opposition be the Democratic Party, members of the media, or some within his own party. That very quality which causes him to be depicted as overly sensitive to criticism, excessively combative, not conciliatory, crude, brusque, offensive, and downright unpresidential, is what gives him an advantage in negotiations with other countries. He is no doubt unique, and I've never seen a president covered quite so negatively by the press. But the criticism of what he says and does actually working to his advantage in negotiations is something that we've seen before. Ronald Reagan was characterized as a cowboy. He was viewed by the left and the media as the extremist president, the one who would get us into a war with the Soviet Union. And in the end, that characterization of Reagan as the cowboy, as the one who would push us too far, helped put pressure on the Soviet Union. In the end, the way that Ronald Reagan was portrayed helped him in negotiations. Ironically, it's helped Donald Trump as well. And frankly, I think he expects at least some of those portrayals, and he uses them to his advantage. And this week, it was to the advantage of the entire country. And next week, I'll be back with another episode. Hopefully, you can use some of my thoughts to your advantage. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and follow me on Twitter @FranklinRye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.